Fabulous. Right, I will hand over to Michael, who's going to go through his HR tricks of the trade, and I will let you get on with it. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much. Right, morning all. Now, I've got to like, I remember at school a teacher trying to share their screen or do a video. Here we go. Let me just share my screen from beginning. Right, hopefully you can all see that. Give me a thumbs up. Great. So morning all, thanks very much for attending. Thanks to Eve and for the chamber. You say I support you, I feel you support me, Eve. So it's a two-way street. So thanks very much for all your help in organising today. Some of you know me, I know, but I think it's worth making a brief introduction. I'm Michael Bauer. I am a 25-year qualified employment solicitor. I've worked for big firms in Manchester and London for the last 14 years. I've been running a specialist practice that I've set up called Cumbria Employment Solicitors, and I'm now finally at the right end of the country. We do every element of employment law. We act for employees and employers, which is quite unusual, but as you'll see as we go through the slides, understanding the mindset of either side is a massive advantage. I was a tribunal judge for 5 years and sat in the Northeast deciding tribunal cases, but it was just too much doing this and running the business. But it did give you a very good insight into the much more difficult job, I think, of deciding cases. And I'll sit sometimes when I'm wrestling with something and try and put my judge's hat back on and think, well, what would I decide on this one? And I think it's a good mindset to have when advising clients. As you'll see, as we go through, we're pretty down to earth. There are 5 of us in the business. We try and be very, very practical and commercial. I think, as you'll see as we go through the slides, I think employment law is often made much more difficult than it needs to be. I think it is often made much more scary than it needs to be. And I think that is massively counterproductive for businesses. This is a taster, obviously. It's an indication about the ways in which I believe HR can be done differently by you and by people like me. As I've said to Eve, at the end of all of this, I'll email the slides and the checklist to Eve and she'll forward them on to you so you'll have them as well, because there are some clauses in here that you can nick and plonk straight into your contracts. We'll talk about them when we get there. So, what are we going to try and achieve today? Oh, hang on, I'm just trying to let people in at the same time. Yeah. Okay.
Don't worry about that, Michael. I'll do that.
Okay, fine. So, key aims. The first thing is to convince you that employment law is largely stacked in favour of the employer. That is not what most people believe. It's to give you some key tips and building blocks for some easy HR wins. There are some things that, if you get it into your head how it works, should make life a lot easier for you. Plus, I'm going to try and give you some practical stuff that you can use in your organisations. I'm going to try and encourage you to use and see employment law as a mechanism to solve problems, tackle issues in your organisation, because that's how it should be used. That's how we try and use it. That's how businesses should try and use it. In fact, to some large extent, that's how employment law is set up. Of course, employees have rights, as they absolutely should, but the balance of it mostly is in favour of the employer. And look, by tackling stuff in the workplace, you end up with a more efficient, more flexible, more manageable, and generally speaking, happier workforce. So to achieve this, the first thing I'm going to do is debunk what I call the employment law myth. I'm then going to look at some principles in terms of how the law actually works. I'm not going to give you cases. I'm not going to give you section numbers because you just don't need all of that. To try and convince you how the decision-making works in certain key employment law processes means that you needn't be worried about dealing with stuff. You've got to be sensible. You can't just rampage around doing as you please, but you can get an awful lot done, low risk, that tackles issues in the workplace. And I say the alternative title for this presentation could have been, it's a bit wordy, which is very much my style, I'm afraid, but it could have been how to use employment law to make your staff happier and your business more profitable. I absolutely believe those two things are connected. You can't keep everybody happy all of the time, and I'm sure, but there is definitely a connection between how people feel about work and how they feel they're being treated and that they're treated fairly, and how they work as employees. And look, I'm prone to exaggeration. I'm not in this attempting to characterize all employees as difficult and feckless, or all employers as paragons of virtue. That is not how life works. I will exaggerate slightly to make points, and I'm talking to employers. And so as a mercenary lawyer, of course I play to the audience. If I was talking to employees, it would be the other way around. So bear with me on that. So, employment law myth. In my experience, employers often think employment law is about box ticking. It's about just getting it done and then putting the policies and the contracts in a dusty drawer to be forgotten. They feel employment law is stacked against them, and is massively in favor of the employee. They're often really worried about just starting something, the hassle of dealing with staff issues. Where do I start? How do I have difficult conversations? Is it going to all be more trouble than it's worth? And therefore things get left. They get put on the too difficult pile, and they sit and they sit and they sit. Managers are concerned about getting things wrong. What happens if I get it wrong? So therefore, again, it's easier not to tackle things. And in my experience, employers are nervous, unduly nervous about the threat of tribunal claims. I've dealt with, it's probably the high hundreds of employment tribunal claims over the course of 25 years. It might even have stretched into the thousands. And I have had, in that time, 3 employees who have been really enthusiastic about going to a tribunal. And all of them were gits. They just wanted to cause trouble. Most employees are really nervous about bringing a claim. It's not what they want to do. They are more nervous than the employer is. So trying to keep this in perspective is important. And the reason I try and I start most of my training with this sort of approach is because until you get the mindset right in terms of how employment law actually operates, it will always seem more difficult than it needs to. The fault for this is my profession, HR professionals, and the press. You never read a newspaper article that says disciplinary process successfully concluded. The newspapers inevitably want the lurid and the unsuccessful. But week in, week out, there is stuff going on where stuff just gets dealt with, employment law issues get dealt with. And the concern I've got, and the reason I start with this in the training, is that the mentality that is put into businesses, clients, regarding employment law, is that it is harder and more risky than it is. And what that does is it means you don't tackle things. And we'll come on to it. One of the absolute truths of employment law is the longer you leave it, the worse it will get. Things become more entrenched, people become more set in their ways. It is toxic and corrosive. It starts to infect other people around them and causes bigger problems. I think also my profession makes employment law more difficult, more scary than it needs to be. I always think asking for legal advice is like asking the time. You want to know the time. You don't want to know how the clock works. You want to know the time. And yes, sometimes there is complexity in advising on these sorts of things or in the issues that you have to confront. But most of the time there isn't. And what should happen is you shouldn't be given, if you seek advice, 3 options. You can do A, B, or C. Do let me know when you've made your mind up. That is not what you want. What you want is, here are the options, and if I were you, for these reasons, I would do this. And you have to make decisions in your working day. Anybody who has to give advice, or anybody who has any kind of management responsibility, you have to make decisions. People in my profession, for some reason, get away with not making decisions. And it's not good enough. The idea of the training is to try and push some of this onto you, to empower you so you're not so reliant upon the likes of me. Because that's what my profession wants. They want to infantilize you and they want to make you fearful because they see reliance correlates with fees. It's a complete mistake. And let me try and tell you what the truth of it is. I've been through most of this. So look, Staff will be your biggest asset, but they will also be your biggest headache. It's the wonder of human beings that we can be the same thing. You can have people who are, you get some employees who are the grumpiest, most difficult people, and you get others who are absolutely fantastic and would bend over backwards. You get some who have got a grumpy exterior, but actually are incredibly helpful underneath. But what I find is, look, most businesses will have some, if you've got human beings working for you, and if you haven't, tell me about it, because that really is revolutionary. But if you've got human beings working with you, you will have some issues of underperformance, absence, and misconduct, because it's just the truth of life. You will have even more difficult to pin down sometimes that general inertia, resistance, inflexibility. Look, you all know how life has been for the last 2-3 years, and how many challenges there've been, and how many things you've had to change. And often you're having to do that because you must. Sometimes you're having to do that because you can see opportunities, and we know we're heading in this direction. Every business is constantly changing. Some employees are up for that, and they like the change and the challenge, but others, you always feel you're dragging them with you. And that inertia, resistance, inflexibility, employment law is set up to tackle it. And I'll tell you about that in a second. Often businesses face working arrangements, contractual arrangements that don't address the current challenges and the current opportunities. Because contracts are written back here, set up back here, and of course life moves on. Most businesses will have elements of overstaffing at the moment. I think it's more understaffing. Trying to find people is incredibly difficult at the moment. Or you have staff poorly allocated, the wrong bums on the wrong seats, or the right bums on the wrong seats, but not sorted out as you need. Or, as I say, that general inflexibility where you know the business has to be flexible in terms of your customers or clients, but staff aren't really set up to give that flexibility within the business. All these issues can be dealt with, and employment law, as we will see, is set up to deal with them. But a failure to deal with them causes problems with productivity, growth, and morale. There is no unhappier group of people than the person who is having to work alongside somebody who is lazy, grumpy, or difficult. The members of that team will know better than anybody the failings of that individual if they're a bully, if they are a gossip and cause just underlying trouble, they're always stirring the pot, or if they are, as I say, lazy, they just do not pull their weight. Those members of the team will know better than anyone how that feels, and will often be thinking, why is no one doing anything about this? Now, that feeling of frustration about, come on, it's unfair, can very easily, human nature being human nature, slide into, well, if Barry doesn't have to do it, why should I bother? And that becomes a slightly toxic, corrosive mentality whereby you have a nose-heavy organization where it starts to infect people. And you don't want that. You want the ethos to be in the other direction. So, as I say, employment law truth number one, the longer you leave it, the worse it gets. So this fear of the law that is engendered by the press, HR professionals and lawyers means you don't tackle stuff. The longer you leave it, the worse it gets. People do not wake up one morning as an employee and say, do you know what? I feel really bad. I've been taking 100% of my wages every month. I've only been given 60% of myself. This ends today. I will now be a better employee. That doesn't happen. What in fact happens normally is the more people are allowed to get away with it, the more they do get away with it. I think, and I don't mean this in any way rude, we are all children at heart. And until somebody says, no further, you must improve, or this behavior is not acceptable, whether it's banter or bullying or gossiping or whatever it happens to be, or laziness, until somebody says this will not be tolerated anymore, people will generally keep doing it. So, and that fear of issues means you don't tackle things, which means it gets worse. And that is what I'm trying to tackle today. So what is the truth of it? Look, the truth is, employment law is absolutely designed to allow you to tackle workplace issues, to allow business to evolve, grow, thrive, along with their staff. So you promote those who are good, and you try and support those that are struggling to come up to standard, and those that aren't good enough or aren't well enough behaved, ultimately the law is set up to allow you to dismiss them. And look, frankly, and you might argue particularly at the moment that capitalism doesn't work, but capitalism would not work if employment law was not set up in this balanced way. Now, that doesn't mean that staff don't have rights. Absolutely, they have rights, and quite correct too. But the balance on most of these things is intended to allow business to make decisions and to change things. Most HR processes are largely common sense and low risk. They're not very exciting, I completely grant you, unless you're a bit of an employment law nerd like me. They're not very exciting, but they are not hard. They are mainly common sense. And generally, there is a very low risk of any claim or challenge if you're issuing a first or even a final written warning. The risk only comes mainly at the dismissal stage. Now, why is that? Why is it? And I'll come on to the statistics in a second. The way this operates is because when you're dealing with a disciplinary situation, so somebody's done something naughty or a performance issue, somebody's not performing to the required standard, the test is not beyond reasonable doubt. Have you proved that they are not up to the required standard? Have you proved that they've done the thing wrong? There is no need even to prove the employee is guilty. There have been cases where two employees are suspected of theft. The employer couldn't decide which one was guilty. Both were dismissed, and that was held to be a fair dismissal. And I'll come on to how that works in a second. You can have situations where you suspect somebody's been stealing, and you've got, evidence. You haven't got the CCTV of that hand in that till at that moment, but you've got a good suspicion and some good evidence to support that suspicion. That is enough to dismiss. You don't have to prove it. And that is what makes the difference. So in an unfair dismissal situation, the tribunal's role in broad terms is to decide, was there a fair process? Did the employer have reasonable grounds to dismiss? Not, was the employee guilty? The tribunal is not allowed to second guess the employer's decision. It's called substitution mindset. And as judges, we knew as practitioners anyway, but as judges, that is not what the tribunal is there to do. It's not there to say, would I have reached this decision in this case? It's there to say, was there a fair process? Did the employer have reasonable grounds to believe they were guilty? And look, frankly, if you followed a fair process, you'll have some evidence. That evidence will suggest whether the person's guilty or innocent. If the evidence suggests they're guilty, you've got reasonable grounds to dismiss if it's theft and it's serious like that. If you haven't got evidence that suggests they're guilty, why the hell are you sacking them? It's very, very simple when it boils down, when you boil it down. In redundancy, making decisions to make people redundant, the business context is largely irrelevant to the tribunal. The tribunal is not interested in how the business has found itself in this position. So I'll often get employee clients saying, well, if only they'd done what they should have done 6 months ago as directors, we wouldn't be in the position of being made redundant. Well, completely irrelevant from a tribunal point of view. The tribunal is also not interested in whether the changes that are being made to create the redundancies will work. Not a matter for a tribunal. I guarantee you, I tell you now, you do not want tribunal judges running businesses. Lovely and intelligent and careful as they are, that is not what they would be good at. So the business decisions are down to the business. So the question in a redundancy setting is the redundancy genuine? Was there a fair process? The law provides for employers to change their contracts of employment unilaterally if needed, and subject to a process, impose those changes on the employees. The test for doing that is, was there a genuine business need? And was a fair process followed? Well, the test for genuine business need is actually a very low level test. And anyway, you'd have to be some kind of masochist to wake up one morning and go, I've got no business need for changing my contracts. I'm just going to cause trouble today. So you're always going to have a business need to do it. So again, these tests are relatively simple, and the processes, whilst not fun, are not difficult. And so the whole point, and the way this should be seen, and the way we operate as a business, with me and my colleagues, is employment law should be seen as a way of making your business more efficient, more flexible, more manageable, and improving morale. It should be there to allow you to go where you need to go, tackle the things that are problematic. That is absolutely how it should be seen, because that is how it is designed. Now, I've told you all of this. Is it true? Okay, I know what people say about statistics. What is it? Lies, damned lies, and statistics. These are the statistics from January to March 2021. I tried to get more up-to-date numbers, but they are changing the way in which they measure things. It means I can't get the detail at the moment. I can only get the headline figures. So, and the year starts in April, so it's for this year that we're behind. So, but these figures are representative, I guarantee you. So, January to March 2021, there were 9,100 single claims were submitted to the tribunals. There will have been a number on top of that of multiple claims submitted by unions on behalf of, let's say, 100 or 1,000 trade union members. So 9,100 single claims, which are the types of claims you would face, were submitted. 11,000 claims in that same period were disposed of. They were concluded. 24% were via ACAS. Some sort of deal was done. We don't know what it was. 18% were withdrawn. For some reason, the claim didn't proceed. 17% were dismissed. They were knocked out. 9% were knocked out. So out of the 100%, I should do the maths on this, a small proportion, the remainder from those figures on the left-hand side, 24, 18, 17, 9, the remainder made it to a final hearing. So got to an actual sitting in front of a judge or a panel of 3, depending on the case, to decide who wins. 89% of those cases that made it to a final hearing were won by the employer. You will not get people who do my job telling you these things normally. I've even seen on websites that figure transposed to frighten employers. Whether it's deliberate or not, I don't know. 89 or 90% of cases are lost by employers. It's not true. 90% are won by employers. And that's not the set of statistics before that, I think it was 94% were won by the employer. And the reason that is as it is, as we'll come on to, is because the way the law is set up means that you have the discretion in most decisions you make and most processes you follow. And I'm afraid this myth has been created by the press, HR professionals, and solicitors. And the aim of it, as I've said, is to try and make you frightened and scared and worried that, God, if I do something, it might be really hard or dangerous. And God forbid I should do it on my own. People might even die. It's so dangerous, because what they want is for you to be frightened and reliant, because that is connected with fees. There is more risk commercially in not tackling problems in the workplace than there is legally in tackling them. And if there is one thing you take away from all of today, that is the point. I think President Obama said, you can win elections by hope or by fear. And it's the same with this sort of thing. Traditionally, my profession wants you to be fearful. What I want you to be is hopeful, because that's what it should be. So I get so excited about all of this, I forget to turn over my pages. Give me a second. And I think we're going to probably take about an hour and a quarter today, and then we've got time for questions. So let's look at how this works. So misconduct and poor performance are common issues. Poor performance is known as capability, and it is particularly badly handled. I think it's because misconduct, if somebody's punched somebody in the mouth, you've got not much choice but to deal with it, and you're dealing with the behavior, whereas performance, you're often talking about the person. You're not very good at this thing. It's much more personal in a way. As I've said, there is no need to prove misconduct or poor performance. In broad terms, all you have to do is follow a fair process. Very important, because that's where the rights of the employee lie. And it's important that those rights are honoured. It is also often done badly by businesses, not because it's particularly hard, but because I think often businesses just don't stop and think about it, or they don't get advice early enough. A lot of it you can do yourself, but it's just that stopping and thinking and working out what you need to do first. Follow a fair process. None of it is particularly hard. You have to genuinely believe the employee is guilty of the misconduct or of the poor performance, and you have to have reasonable grounds for that belief. I.e., you have to have some evidence that suggests when you think Sheila's been stealing, that Sheila has in fact been stealing. you then have to impose a fair and proportionate sanction. And again, and I'm not going to get into the detail today because we haven't got time, employers have quite a wide discretion when it comes to decisions about sanction. The tribunal, again, is not there to say, oh, we really like Barry, we wouldn't have dismissed, we'll have given him a final written warning. That is not what the tribunal is there to do. The tribunal is there to say, essentially, was the sanction you applied reasonable? And the ability, final bullet point there, the tribunal only gets a look in if a claim is brought, and a claim can only be brought in limited circumstances. And normally, if you're following a disciplinary process or a performance review process, at first written warning stage and at final written warning stage, there's no dismissal. So there can be no unfair dismissal claim. The employee could argue you're behaving in a discriminatory way. They could resign and claim constructive dismissal. Both are incredibly rare. It's very rare that somebody resigns in these processes and claims constructive dismissal because it's a stupid thing to do. And most people don't do things that are against their own best interests. If the allegation is that the process is discriminatory, you should have a pile of evidence that says, no, I'm handling this process because you smacked Barry in the mouth. Or I'm dealing with this issue of poor performance because we keep getting customer service complaints about you. So what I'm really saying is issuing a first written warning and issuing a final written warning are very low risk because the scope for a claim is incredibly narrow. Now, I'm not saying you willy-nilly go back once you finish the day and start firing, first written and final written warnings around. What I'm trying to say is, if you've got somebody, and you all will have somebody who is not doing as they should be doing, tackling it and going through a fair process, and it must be fair and it must be legitimate, is actually, and issuing a first written warning is actually incredibly low risk. But the benefits it brings, if it's legitimate, it sends a one, you're tackling somebody who's not performing. Two, it sends a massively strong message to the rest of the workforce. And three, those people who've been working with Lazy Sheila or Lazy Barry say, thank God, that's finally been dealt with. And the aim is to get them up to the standard. So it's a very low risk, easy win type situation. So I'm going to very quickly, because this is not really what today's about, nip through what the basic requirements are for misconduct and poor performance. Look, as was detailed in later slides, we do much more in-depth training, me and the chamber, on these issues at various times in the year. I think we're doing a poor performance on the 11th of August, from start to finish, where we get absolutely into the detail. We can do bespoke training as needed as well. So I'm just going to whip through this. Got to be a fair investigation, and normally, so this is misconduct. Someone's done something wrong. You've got to have a fair investigation. Normally, you would have an investigatory meeting, so you'd sit the individual down and say, what happened on Thursday? It's this bit of the process in misconduct scenarios that employers handle worst. It's the bit that is most important, because if you get this bit right, everything else follows. Because, as I've said, your decision is, have I got reasonable grounds to believe they're guilty? Those reasonable grounds come from a decent investigation. So if you get the investigation right, everything else, that puts you in a massively strong position for anything that happens next. You've got to write to the person inviting them to the disciplinary hearing, giving them details of the allegations, all the evidence, give them reasonable notice, and their right to be accompanied to that hearing. You have the hearing, you let them respond and say their piece, and you take that seriously. You listen, you understand it, you reflect on what they've said, you ask questions. You don't have to make two decisions. Are they guilty of the thing that's been they've been accused of? And I'll come back to that. And the second question is, if so, what sanction should I apply? On the first question, are they guilty? You've got to have a genuine belief that they're guilty on reasonable grounds, i.e. there's a pile of evidence that suggests they are. That is not the same as proving that they stole the thing, or they smacked somebody in the mouth, or they didn't follow a reasonable instruction, or all the other crazy things that people can do at work. The best one I've had recently is the Formula One race that two lads were having in the warehouse on the business's forklift trucks at lunchtime, stringing around the warehouse on their forklift trucks. I mean, very entertaining, I'm sure, but gross misconduct? Yep, absolutely. So, and that was quite easy to prove because you had CCTV. But often there's doubt, there's uncertainty. Have they done it? Have they not? You don't have to prove it. If you've established on reasonable grounds a genuine belief that they're guilty, then you issue a warning, and that warning, so you issue a sanction. It might be dismissal if it's gross misconduct, it might be a first written warning, it might be a final written warning. You have to communicate that outcome in writing with reasons and with a right of appeal, and if they do appeal, you have to deal with that appeal fairly and confirm the outcome of it. None of that is hard. So that is what a fair process looks like, which is the first requirement for a fair dismissal. Capability, a bit more fiddly capability. So capability is essentially performance. And we'll go into it in a bit more detail in a second. So that's a three-stage process. Unless somebody's done something grossly negligent, managing poor performance is a three-stage process, because what the law says is the person has to be given 2 formal warnings before they can be dismissed. Because the idea of performance management is to get the person to the required standard. That's what everybody wants. And if you can get them to the required standard, job done, everybody's happy. But if they're not able, for whatever reason, to get to the required standard, then the process involves 2 formal warnings before you can dismiss. And after each warning, so it goes first written warning, then final written warning, then dismissal. And at each stage after you've given a warning, you need to give support, training, input to try and get that person to the required standard. And you have to give them some time to improve. Basic requirements for each stage are, again, a reasonable investigation. What is it that exemplifies that person's poor performance? Is it, yet again, they've not put a report in on time? Is it the report has got loads of errors in it? Is it, and we'll come on to various examples of poor performance. What is the poor performance? So you've got an investigation, you've got some pieces of paper, statements, whatever it happens to be, as to what that poor performance looks like. You then, again, write to them, providing the evidence, calling them to a hearing to say, these are the concerns we've got, this is what we expect of you, come and talk to us about it. And they have an opportunity at that hearing to challenge what you're saying. You then, just as with misconduct, consider the evidence and what they've had to say, and you've got to make 2 decisions. 1, do I genuinely believe they've been underperforming? And 2, if so, what sanction? Again, you don't have to prove they've underperformed. You've just got to have a genuine belief they've underperformed based on reasonable grounds. And you should have reasonable grounds because there should be a pile of evidence that you've got. Otherwise, what the hell are you doing all this for? If you've decided they're not performing, you write to them, confirming the outcome, what is expected of them going forwards, and what support normally you would provide, and you confirm their right of appeal. Now, at stage 1, the sanction is likely to be a first written warning. At stage 2, it's likely to be a final written warning. At stage 3, it's likely to be dismissal. But the same process is the same for each. The process is the same for each stage. In between the warning and the decision whether to escalate things up again, you have to provide reasonable support and guidance, and you have to keep an eye on how they're getting on and feed back to them. And it's all really common sense. And then, given them a first written warning, you said, right, we're going to put a little bit more training in. Me and you are going to have a mentoring meeting each Friday morning to see how you're getting on, and we're going to keep it under review. We'll have a catch up properly after a month, and then we're going to look at it again more formally at 3 months to see how you're getting on. At that 3-month stage, you've got a decision to make. Hopefully, and this is what you're aiming for, job done. They just needed a bit of a nudge or a bit of help or a bit of a kick up the backside sometimes. They've got to the required standard. We're all happy. We don't have to escalate. Or actually, there are still major problems and we are now going to escalate, and then you start stage 2, which is moving to a final written warning. And then again, exactly the same process. If they're not managing, you get up to stage 3 and dismissal. These are not hard things to do. It's not fun, but I tell you, it's a lot more fun than constantly having somebody who's underperforming or badly behaved. Because as I say, if you don't tackle these things, it spreads. It might take time, but it spreads. It causes problems. And it upsets those around you. And the bad push out the good. Because I see it happen all the time. We know, and we will tell clients, look, and they'll come to us and say, look, it's just, this is happening, that's happening, the other's happening. We'll get into the detail and we will say, look, we can change the culture of that team. Give us 2 months. And what normally happens is you start off getting the documentation right. We'll come on to that in a second. You then implement the documentation. So you have some rules and you implement the rules. And people either play by those rules, perfect, thank you very much, tick the box. Or if they don't play by those rules are fair, they're reasonable, they're communicated. If those rules aren't played by, then do you know what? There are going to be consequences. Now that consequence hopefully will be limited to a first written warning. But if you don't learn, ultimately we will remove you. And the law provides for that. The best example I had was somebody who had been a pain in the backside for 22 years. And only when the credit crunch came and the business was really struggling, they had to start making tough decisions, did they tackle it. 22 years of this person being a pain. It took us 6 weeks and they were gone. And they were gone cleanly and tidily with very limited hassle to the client. And all we had to do is to say, these are the rules, you now have a choice. And that is essentially what it's about. And as I say, we're all children at heart. We need rules. So I'm going to look a little bit more in detail at capability, but a lot of the things I'm saying in principle apply for conduct as well. It's just that performance is much more badly handled than employers than conduct. Conduct is a bit easier. Performance is often let go. People let it ride because they think, well, I'm getting 75% out of them. I'll just let it ride. I'll let it carry on like that. So poor performance legally is classed as capability. And the definition, you're not going to get much law from me in a sort of formal legal sense in this training. I think there are 2 pieces in it because clients don't want law. You want answers. You want a route map to get you from here to there. And as I say, you want to know the time. You don't want to know how the clock works. So capability, as defined by section 98(3)(a) of the Employment Rights Act 1996, this is what it says. Capability should be assessed by reference to an employee's skill, aptitude, health, or any other physical or mental quality. That is massively widely defined. So it can include you're not making enough widgets, you're not producing enough reports, you're not cleaning enough rooms, you're not selling enough things. It can be quite a binary thing, black and white. You haven't hit the measure. It can be that you're just making too many mistakes. The work you're producing is not up to the required standard. It can be that they're not achieving set tasks or projects, or they're failing to meet sales, customer satisfaction, or other performance measures. And what tends to happen is employers think they're just not doing what they're supposed to be doing. You've got to go one step further in your thinking on that and break down that instinct into why do I feel that when it comes to those 4 bullet points. But the definition of capability is so wide, it also covers, which is a common thing in businesses, that awkwardness, that negativity, that slight grumpiness you get from somebody who is always desperate to say no. We know it. We know it when you go into a shop, where you speak to, when you're the customer, when you speak to somebody on the phone and they're just so keen to be unhelpful. No, computer says no. That type of mentality, we all know it when we feel it. What we don't want is our customers and clients to be feeling it. And it's difficult to pin down, but that definition that says, or any other mental quality, being a grumpy git is a mental quality. I mean, it's not a very good quality. So these things that are quite general, quite hard to pin down, the person who, when you're saying, right, we've got this great new initiative, we're introducing this new product or whatever it happens to be, and you've got Barry at the back of the room going, never going to work, that's never going to work. That type of mentality, section 98(3)(a) gives you a mechanism for dealing with it. And that sort of mentality is incredibly corrosive. I've seen it so many times. You go into an organization and what you find is all the staff are tiptoeing round the most awkward, unreasonable member of staff in the team. And you see people desperately bending how they do things in order to not upset the most difficult member of the team. And you think, what the hell are you doing? Deal with the most difficult member of the team. And this is the mechanism by which you do it. You all will have had experience of when that person's on holiday, the whole place feels different. That team just feels different because they're not there. Well, that's hard work for their colleagues. That's people having to tolerate something that you're allowing to happen. It doesn't have to be that way. The longer you leave it, the worse it gets. These things are toxic and infectious. It's very low risk to tackle it. Lazy colleagues are a drag. Difficult colleagues are a drag. And often, I'm not saying always, but often I've had cases where there was one case, this particular person had been really difficult for about 6 years. And a new manager came in. And the manager had a word with her. And she was mortified at how she'd been making everybody feel. She went around everybody and apologized. It was like that. Now, I'm not saying it is always like that. But until you start to tackle it, there is no chance of the problem being solved. The longer you leave it, the worse it will get. And it is infectious. It's very easy to address. So just going back to, and as I said, 89% win for the employer in the tribunal dealing with this sort of thing. The reason for that is because you don't have to prove misconduct and you don't have to prove poor performance. And this is I can't remember the name of the case, but this is a quote from a judgment from the Court of Appeal. I've changed it because at the time, it's quite an old case. It said whenever a man is dismissed, I don't think they anticipated at the time that women might work, but so I've changed it to person. So whenever a person is dismissed for incapacity or incompetence, it is sufficient the employer honestly believes on reasonable grounds that the person is incapable or incompetent. It is not necessary for the employer to prove that they are in fact incapable or incompetent. That quote encapsulates what I've been banging on about, why 90% of claims are won by employers, why these processes are low risk, and why the commercial risk of not tackling this stuff is much bigger than the legal risk of tackling it. So I'm going to give you some general tips and then we're going to move on to documentation. Check the time. Yeah. So informal discussions. Communication, this is about. Timely management action will often be enough to deal with something. You can nip it in the bud. So just saying, calling somebody to one side and saying, what's going on? Why are you like this? Or how do you think you're getting on with other staff? That sort of discussion would be enough to change things. So if someone's not performing or misbehaving, raise it with them. Make it their problem. It's a wonderful feeling, in my experience, to take the frustration you're feeling about how somebody else is behaving and saying, do you know what? I'm going to give all this to you. It's now your problem. You're not sanctioning them. There's no formal warning. You're just communicating. Call them in. They don't need notice unless your procedures say differently, in which case you need to change your procedures. Call them in, explain the concerns, seek a response for them. Now, it may be that they say, yeah, I have been really crabby recently, but I've got some real problems at home. Okay, that's incredibly useful information. You can use that to be supportive. You can encourage them potentially to tell members of the team, so the members of the team can say, okay, instead of getting annoyed with you because you're a bit short-tempered, we're going to try and support you. It's about communication. Or it may be that actually there isn't an excuse for it and they've just got to buck their ideas up, in which case you're giving the problem to them. Explain the concern, seek a response, and ideally agree what's going to happen next. Is any support needed if it's a performance issue? Agree a time frame. We'll have a chat about this in a month's time. Let's see how you get on. Do you need some kind of basic informal plan as to how it's going to work? Depends what it is. Make a note of it. We'll come on to that in a second. Confirm what you're expecting in writing, not in any great formal sense. Brief email, and we'll come on to that in a second. And set a date when you're going to have a chat about it again. And if the person, excuse me, scratching my nose, if somebody is on probation, consider extending that probation. Don't do what clients do all the time. Come to me, normally 1 year and 11 months after they started employing somebody, and say, oh, can we get rid of them? They're awful. And I said, well, okay, what happened at probation? Oh yeah, we put them through probation. What happened at their appraisal? Oh yeah, free, satisfactory, keep up the good work. No one's told the person they're not very good, but suddenly you want to go from no action to dismissal. The aim is not to lose people. to get them to the required standard, and that requires telling them what your concerns are. And that means extending probation if that's what's needed. It is often simple and effective. You're just saying, I'm a bit worried about this thing, or is there anything going on? What's up? You don't see me yourself. It's also fair to the employee. How the hell can they be given a chance to improve if they don't even know there's a problem? And it often avoids the need to escalate, which is a win. You don't have to come and see me. You don't have to talk to your HR provider. You don't have to get involved in difficult processes. You've had a chat with somebody and you've solved the problem. If, however, it doesn't work and you do have to escalate matters, the fact that you've had an informal chat and you've got a record of it, of course, it strengthens your position. It's useful. It puts you in a more reasonably appearing position. If it's not written down, it didn't happen. Proper records are key, and they'll help you through any process. I'm dealing with a situation at the moment where somebody has not been performing. Thankfully, the nature of the poor performance is pretty damn obvious, but they haven't been performing for 18 months. There is not a single piece of paper recording. There have been conversations. There's not a single piece of paper recording the nature of those discussions. That's just making life harder for yourself. You don't know when you have that informal chat with somebody if it's going to solve the problem or if you're going to end up having to dismiss them ultimately. Obviously, you hope for the best, but you prepare for the worst. And if you've got records, you're in a much stronger position. Which is better? A file with a series of records saying, we talked to you at your probation, you just about scraped through your probation. We gave you some further support because we were concerned about this and this, but there were still issues. You just about managed to get through the 2 years, but it wasn't great. There were further discussions, there were further adjustments to your duties. We've got to the point where you're going to have to go. That trajectory of your efforts to try and get them to a standard and clear evidence of support and guidance, gosh, that puts you in a stronger position when it comes to a formal process. And it's much stronger than you going, I think we had a discussion in May, and I think I said something along the lines of it. I know it seems ridiculous, but anybody who manages a group of managers who manage the shop floor, for want of a better term, will know managers don't keep notes of stuff. They often do not record what's being said, and they need to be doing it, and you need to be doing it too. So, if you're taking the trouble of being fair and following a process, record it. It reduces risks, it makes life easier for you, you stand a better chance of success. It also sets a tone about how you do things. It's also great if you end up in that unlikely event being cross-examined in front of an employment tribunal judge when you're referred to your first informal discussion with somebody where the thing that they were ultimately dismissed for 12 months later, you were already trying fairly and openly to tackle. Oh my God, that creates an impression. It also means if you are having to get rid of somebody, I always see it as like you're going up a cliff. In fact, you're pushing somebody off a cliff, but if you get what I mean, you're taking somebody up. Now, you want the gradient to be as gentle as you can make it. What clients often do is because they put no effort into creating that gradient, you end up in a situation where, oh my God, we've got to get rid of them. You're having to go straight up the front of the cliff. This paperwork and these discussions build the gradient that means if you do get to the point where you have to dismiss somebody, that final step is actually not such a big step because everybody knows it's coming. And, you know, none of this should be a surprise for somebody, but it often is because the process isn't handled well. So make a note of your discussions. What is agreed and decided in any next steps? As I've said, it's helpful to confirm it in writing. It doesn't have to be a big, scary thing. All it has to do is a brief email. We discussed concerns A, B, and C. We agreed X, Y, and Z. In terms of what would happen, what we would do, what you would do, what was expected. We'll have another chat on Thursday week. It's no more complicated than that, but it's very different from having an empty personnel file. Simple, effective, it also sets a tone and an ethos, and as a manager, it gives you respect because you're fair, you're dealing with stuff properly. Difficult conversations. Look, some of these conversations that managers are expected to have with staff are not easy. They are stressful. every time I go into a disciplinary meeting or a performance review meeting on particularly redundancies, I get butterflies, and long may that continue. Because the moment you start taking this stuff for granted, you're doing it badly. And particularly with redundancy, you're taking away potentially somebody's livelihood, which means you may be taking away their home, which means you may be taking away their family. Now, I'm not saying you should feel the weight of that to the point where it's paralyzing, but it should be a responsibility you take seriously. And I tell you what, there is nothing more likely to motivate an employee than being treated dismissively and disrespectfully in these sorts of processes, or in a way where the manager isn't prepared. I went into a disciplinary a few weeks ago where the manager had not prepared, and it was horrific. In the end, I just had to take over because the employee was highly motivated and had done their homework, and the manager it was a formality. They hadn't read the papers, they weren't up on what the score was, they hadn't read the advice, and the employee was running rings around him. Don't do that. Don't turn a strength into a weakness. Very often when we're consulted by employee clients, we'll look at the paperwork, and my view will be, or my colleague's view will be, actually the employer was in the right here broadly, he just handled it so badly that we've now got enough to get our crowbar in and start shaking the employer about. It's often avoidable. How do you do that? Well, in my experience, things that are difficult, the more you prepare, the more you manage them effectively and the less stressful they are. So prepare. Have a clear grasp of what is alleged, get across the paperwork, understand what it is you want to say, even if it's informal, a bullet point of what you want to say. There is no point in having a script because it will go off script very quickly and then you're at sea. You just want stepping stones to get you from A to B because you already know it. Pick your battles. You can choose the moment that you're going to have that informal conversation with somebody. So get it to the point where you think, I've got enough examples now of Dave being grumpy that it's difficult for him to disagree. So you pick your moment. Rehearse. I will do that. I've done that for today. It may not have seemed that I have, but I've paced around this office running through the training because it means you're familiar with it. You know where you're heading next. And it means if you get blown off course, which you will, you can get yourself back to where you want to be. Allow enough time. This is important. Allow enough time and somewhere private. Don't do it as clients of mine have done in the past. Bring it up in the pub after work one night. I mean, what the hell? Take it seriously. Deal with it responsibly. Be firm, be fair, be respectful, maintain dignity for all, including yourself. And part of that I include is accepting that these can be difficult, slightly stressful conversations. In the modern parlance, be kind to yourself about it. Accept that you're going to be a bit stressed, maybe. But being firm sometimes means, hang on a minute, let me just finish. Taking control of the meeting. Not in a way that is oppressive or disrespectful or denies the other person their ability to speak, but in a way that says there are rules for how this is going to be. And that gravitas often comes from being well prepared. Say what you mean. I mean, the classic is the case where somebody is accused of falsifying, no, they're accused of errors on their timesheet, when what the employer is in fact saying is, you're fiddling your timesheets. If that's what it is, that's what you need to say, because otherwise there's a big difference between saying, we think you've made some mistakes, to we think you're behaving dishonestly. And I'm talking about in the informal setting here. So often, if you think somebody's being awkward or unapproachable, find a way of saying that. Keep it calm. Try not to keep it personal. It can be difficult. So, why are you so lazy is not a good starting point. And remember, these conversations are informal. There's no warning, there's no sanction, you're just communicating. And you've got the upper hand. You're the manager. You've got reasons, you've got the evidence, you've got the law on your side. You've picked your moment. There's so much that is to your advantage. You've got the bits of paper in terms of policies and procedures, or should have, that give you the advantage too. So how do you get it? Often you can get it moving by asking open questions. How do you think you get on with the other staff? How do you think it's going? I've got one client who says, what do you think I think of you? Which is an evil question. What do you think I think of you? He says what they tell me what they think of themselves. I'm not saying you say that because I think that's a bit unpleasant, but open questions. How's it going? Quite often, people will know there's a problem and they might just say, well, I've been a bit down recently because my wife's not very well. My husband's not very well. It's playing on my mind. Okay, well, you're going to deal with that differently than the person who says, I think you'll find I'm perfect. I've never done anything wrong ever. It's all them. But you've got to break into that conversation. An open question will sometimes get the other person speaking, and they do a lot of the hard work for you. Not always the case. Sometimes people roll up like a jockey who's fallen off a horse. They just make themselves as small as they can, and they don't want to give you any cut. Don't know what you mean. Don't know what you're talking about. No idea. Don't know why I'm here. In which case, you're going to have to be more direct. You're going to have to prize them open. And if ultimately they say, you know, let's say there's been a blow up on Thursday, there's been a row. What happened on Thursday? Nothing as far as I'm concerned. It was entirely the other person. You're going to be able to ultimately to gather evidence to suggest the contrary, in which case somebody who takes an unreasonable and untenable position, you'll use the evidence to beat them to death, metaphorically, obviously. So if somebody who is completely intransigent in face of the evidence, they're going to struggle. Remember, it's informal. There's no sanction here. You are just communicating. You're just saying there is a problem. You're being fair to the employee and giving them an opportunity to respond and explain and disagree, but also potentially to go, yeah, you've got a point. Yeah, you've got a point. Let's work on that. Stick to your own procedures. Seek advice as needed. It is much easier to get advice at the beginning than it is when people come to me and it's a mess and I say, well, I wish you'd come to me earlier. The office time machine's broken. It's much easier to keep somebody on track at the beginning than it is to, you know, disentangle the wreckage if it's gone wrong. We offer, anyone who's been on this training, we offer what we call our brain picking service. So if you're worried about something, give us a shout. Pick up the phone, give us a ring, and we'll say, we can normally say, I would do this, this, and this. 10, 15 minutes on the phone. You're never going to get a bill for that from us. What we want is you to be able to communicate. Because if you feel you can communicate and you're not going to get a bill, you'll tackle stuff that will make your businesses better, and you're less likely to cock it up and us have to dismantle the wreckage. Pick up the phone to us. And the same's true. We've got questions at the end, and it's going to end up being about an hour and a quarter, I would say. In fact, maybe slightly more. We've got questions at the end, but if there's anything you want to talk about privately, just give me a shout. Give me a shout afterwards. Now, I'm going to have to put my foot down a bit, as ever. I'm going a bit too slowly. So, recording of meetings is incredibly common. It happens all the time. I had a big case a few years ago which pretty much hinged upon meetings being recorded. Covert recordings are generally admissible in employment tribunal proceedings. It's not illegal to covertly tape somebody, and that evidence is normally admissible. So be aware of it. Include in your policies that covert taping is not allowed and could amount to gross misconduct. But even more sensibly, do what I do at the beginning of meetings. Make a big, can everyone turn their phones off, please? And you know, there's a number of times I've seen the look on the face of the person who thinks, oh damn, I was going to take this meeting, and you think, ha. Turn it off. Now, there may be times where it's appropriate to take a meeting. I don't have a problem with a meeting being taped if you know it's being taped. What I have a problem with is covert taping. So get everyone to turn their phones off. Ideally, don't say inappropriate, embarrassing things that you'd be horrified at when they're played back on a recording. Beware of text messages, texts and messages. Oh my God, people use text and messaging as if it's speech, but it's not, it's permanent. It's evidence. And the last case I did as a tribunal judge involved text messages passing between a manager and a junior member of staff that they were sexually explicit pretty much throughout. So you know, aubergines left, right, and centre, and all of that sort of thing going on. Completely outrageous. There is no way those people would put that in an email. Never mind a letter, but somehow text messages are different. And I've had a number of cases over the years, including as a judge, where the crucial evidence is text and message, because people say things that they would never say in an email. but they still have to be disclosed in tribunal proceedings, so be careful. Beware of indiscreet internal communication. So let's say at the beginning of a redundancy process, the managers are talking, and I've never done a redundancy process yet where the client doesn't say, there are 5 people over there and we only need 3, and we quite like these 2 to be the ones that go. That's how redundancy, I'm afraid, tends to work. Often there'll be internal communications that say that we need fewer people and we'd quite like it to be Barry and Sheila that go. I don't know why I always pick on Barry and Sheila, but anyway. We want those 2 to go, and there'll be messages between them or emails. Those messages are disclosable via a subject access request under the data protection legislation or by way of an employment tribunal disclosure order. So be careful what you're saying. Ideally behave lawfully, clearly, but be careful what you're saying in those internal communications because they can be disclosed. And that, I'm afraid, is even between a client and an HR professional. Not me. Lawyers get a different category. I think it's completely wrong. I think HR professionals should be given the same, it's called privilege protection, where there's confidentiality in certain categories of legal communication, but HR professionals don't get it. So be careful. Right. I'm going to whip through contracts and policies. Another reason why employers have a massive upper hand is because you get to set the rules of the game, because you get to write the contract subject to certain things that you have to have and certain limits that are imposed by law. You get to set it. Big advantage. So look, staff are normally an organisation's biggest expense, and so inevitably the paperwork by which you govern those relationships will be important. They set out contracts, job description, staff handbook, set out the rights and obligations and expectations for both parties. It's what the employees can expect of the employer too. And it must follow that if you get those documents right, i.e. tailored to the needs of your organisation, that will assist you in achieving success. And look, proper paperwork should go to the bottom line. It should be about improving the business, and they should also improve morale, ideally. There should be a fair balance between the rights of the employer and the rights of the employee, although the employer has the upper hand. And if I'm acting for the employer, you'll draft to the advantage of the employer. So your documentation, contracts and your policies should be designed for the current needs of the business, but also the future needs of the business. And if you get it right, they should always build in that elasticity, that the paperwork should have wording in it that gives you room for maneuver in the future. So if something desperate happens, or there's an opportunity, or you have to pivot in one direction or another, and goodness me, we've had to make some changes over the last couple of years, the paperwork should give you some degree of elasticity so you can maneuver, you can adjust. And this paperwork should be building in flexibility, control, protection, and efficiency. That's what it should be doing. You should have contractual flexibility in things like hours people work, where they work, their duties. So if you need to make changes in the future, you're not necessarily having to consult with the staff because you've already built that elasticity into the contract. Clear rights and rules are fair to both managers and to staff. Everybody knows where they stand. Human beings like that. It limits the chance of challenges and of disputes because people know where they stand. And it does mean if there is a problem, you can go look at the paperwork and say, oh no, it says this. This is what the score is. That limits the scope for things to get out of control. It also sets a tone and it sets expectations. It manages risk and it avoids risks that you can avoid, and they're often hidden. I'll come on to something about that in a second. So contracts and policies are 2 different things. The contracts are the legally binding element, and they contain the key legal rights between the employer and the employee. And they generally, although there is a process you can go through to change things, cannot be changed at will. You're obliged to have certain information in the form of what's called written particulars in a document, and that has to be provided to employees and now workers. The law changed in April 2020. It used to be you have to give these documents within 2 months of somebody starting. They now have to be provided immediately. The law, as I say, changed in April 2020. Additional information is required in written particulars, what I would call contracts, and additional information has to be contained in a single document. It used to be you were able to spread it out more between a single document called the principal document, and a readily accessible document. Bloody lawyers, eh? So April 2020, changes came in. You're going to have more stuff in your documentation and more stuff in the single document. That only applies to employees who started after April 2020. You don't have to go and change your contract for those who started earlier. But I am regularly seeing contracts issued to staff post-April 2020 that do not comply with the rules. And I haven't got the time in this session to go through what has to be in one, but you can look it up. And we also do, and I'll come on to it in a second, we do also do an employment law audit where we'll go for free, we'll go through your paperwork and say red, amber or green. We'll assess it for free and we'll feed back to you as to what you need to do. Policies, normally hopefully contained in the staff handbook, are not legally binding or shouldn't be legally binding if they're handled correctly. And they are like the operating manual of the business. Key expectations, how certain situations will be handled, key rules. So your disciplinary procedure, your sickness management procedure, all that sort of stuff. Again, massively common error is there is a mix between what's in the contract and what's in the staff handbook. So you've got contractual stuff in the staff handbook, you've got non-contractual stuff in the contract. I've seen, and I often see, where the employer's made their whole staff handbook contractual, disastrous, because it means if it says, we will give the outcome of the disciplinary meeting within 5 days. If you don't give it within 5 days, you're technically in breach of contract. The contract should contain the contractual stuff. The staff handbook should be non-contractual because it means you can change it whenever you want. You have to have the written particulars, as I've said, of certain key things in your contracts. The only things you need in terms of other policies are a grievance and disciplinary policy. Via GDPR, you have to have a staff privacy notice, and you pretty much have to have a data protection policy, and obviously you've got to have your health and safety rules. So those are the things you have to have. You've got to have written particulars setting out the main terms, and then you've got to have in that fourth from bottom bullet point, that's the other stuff you have in policy and procedures. They're the only things you have to have. Sensible businesses have more than that because it means you can manage things better for all the reasons I've said. It's risk management, it's setting the rules, it gives you processes to follow, it makes life a lot easier. Try not to muddle up the contractual and the non-contractual, very common. I also think it's sensible to have job descriptions, setting out what's expected, along with the inevitable weasel words of the lawyer that says anything else I can think of in the job description. Get contracts signed. A number of times I deal with cases where the contracts haven't been signed and therefore certain clauses will just be unenforceable, restrictive covenants included. If you've gone to the trouble of issuing them, get them signed, for goodness sake. So what do you want in them? I'm almost going to just go through this because actually this is for your future reference so you can cross-check against what you've got and what I'm saying you should have. Now, this is not the stuff you legally have to have, because you can look that up online. What I'm giving you is the extra bits and pieces that I think you should have if you're doing it well. So firstly, from your contracts, take out anything that shouldn't be in there and is non-contractual and should be in the handbook. You should have a clause that says the person's got the right to work in the UK. That is a legal requirement for you to check that too. And that if anything changes, that they have to notify you. You should have clauses dealing with short-time working and layoff that allow you to reduce hours or lay off staff. That's what the furlough scheme essentially was. Most of any of my clients who had me draft their contract, they already had a furlough scheme built in. It didn't pay the wages, but it allowed you to go, oh my God, we're having to close everything, we're going to lay you off. I had clients during the 2008 floods. If it wasn't for 2 paragraphs in their contract, the business would have folded. But because they had layoff clauses, they were able to lay off staff when their premises got flooded and save themselves a fortune. Strong flexibility clauses allowing changes to employees' duties, hours and place of work. Not we can make you do anything we want, but building in that elasticity that as the business changes and what you need people to do changes, you've got that elasticity that says, well, clause 4 says, I can ask you to do this. Probationary period for all new staff and for all newly promoted staff. I like a 3-month probationary period with the right to extend for 3 months. Take it seriously. Look at whether somebody's performing during probation. Have a clause that allows you to make deductions from wages for any amounts due to you. Because except in limited circumstances, if you haven't got that express right to make deductions and you withhold an amount that's genuinely owed to you by an employee from their wages, you're breaking the law and you have to pay the money back, and you're not allowed to get it back even though it's entitled. I had a case a few years ago where the employee was living in a rented property provided by the employer, nice property, the employee was genuinely and happily paying rent, but it was being deducted from their wages, but there was no clause permitting the employer to make that deduction. When they fell out and we got involved, we caused absolute havoc. There were actually 38 of these staff with these contracts. They'd all been paying rent from their wages quite happily for the whole time of their employment. Because there was no deductions clause, we could claim all of that money back from the employer, who is now a client, I hasten to add. The employer was apoplectic with their well-known local firm of solicitors who hadn't done it. The fact they had to pay them nearly 250 grand in compensation for race discrimination didn't help either. And as I say, they are now one of my clients. So have a clause that says the employee must comply with instructions given by managers and with your policies. If you have staff regularly working when averaged over a 17-week period, 48 hours, then over 40 hours, then put in an opt-out clause. Have strong clauses controlling the allocation and refusal of holiday and controlling holiday periods. The law provides a great deal of leeway in employers managing holiday. It's often not utilised. Have clauses that allow you to manage holiday in a way that suits you. Have a clause that says you've got to work hard and do your best for us, a best endeavours clause, and a clause that says when you're at work, you work. Have clauses that deal with alternative work that people may have outside your place of work. That's both important from a competitive point of view, where else are they working, but also from a health and safety point of view, particularly at the moment when people may be struggling, that they are working, they might get a second job. So they're working for you, then they're off going doing another 6 hours in the evening. That's a health and safety issue. You need to know about that. If you're going to have bonuses and overtime and time off in lieu, clearly defined. It has to be in the written particulars. It should be clearly defined. I had a case a few years ago where an employer had put together a bonus that was really shabbily drafted, and for months after my client had left, we were demanding more bonus pay because they drafted it badly. There's just been a case as well of I think it was an accounts manager during the pandemic. The business got a massive contract for supplying PPE or something like that. Their turnover went through the roof. The employee, who'd previously been getting quite a modest bonus, has just won her case in tribunal for her to be paid her £234,000 bonus, all because the bonus was poorly drafted and didn't have a cap on it. So if you're going to have a bonus, define it, do it properly, pin it down, give you yourself the chance to amend it. And as I said at the beginning, these things they're about fairness, and they're about setting the rules, but it's also about driving to the bottom line. It's also about managing costs. Have a clause that allows you to recover training costs if the person leaves in defined circumstances and within a defined period. Nothing more frustrating than you investing in somebody and then they leave, go around the corner to a competitor, and essentially you've invested in your competitor. It would be good at least to get some of the money back that you spent on that person. Clearly define any rights to contractual sick pay. Often incredibly badly done. And I've seen situations where technically the way in which the contractual sick pay was managed meant that the person could have their, I think 3 months full pay, 3 months half pay, could return to work for a brief period of time and it would re-trigger that entitlement. So of course that's what they did. It's in the drafting, get that right. Make workable provisions for notice periods. Often I'll see somebody who started off as the data inputter, right at the bottom of the finance department of the business. 10 years later, she's the finance director. She's still on the notice period she had when she was the data inputter, that she could give a week's notice, which would be disastrous to that business. Have workable notice provisions that gives you time to recruit. Now, of course, you've got to set that and balance it against having somebody who doesn't want to be there for 6 months. You know, I would say 3 months is about the limit, but think about it. You don't also have to have the same notice for you as for the employee. The employer is stuck with the statutory minimum, though, which means you have to give, the employer has to give essentially a week's notice for each complete year of service, up to a maximum of 12 weeks. If you have contractual sick pay, this is a nice little one I like, try and have a clause in your contract that says if an employee goes off sick during a disciplinary performance or grievance process, that their contractual sick pay drops to SSP. Because I'm afraid, incredibly frequently, people who are facing one of those processes will go off sick. They'll often be looking for a new job and have no intention of returning to work, but they're looking for a new job at full pay at your expense. Well, that provision drops them down to SSP. Fine. If you want to look for a new job, that's fine, but it's at 95, 96 quid a week instead. Have provision for medical reports where there is prolonged or persistent short-term absence, so you can send somebody off to go and get a medical report on them. And have the right to require medical certificates if there is an issue with absence. They have to get a medical certificate for each absence. Have the right to suspend employees in a disciplinary context, because otherwise you don't have the permission to respond to suspend them. Allow for demotion or a transfer as a potential disciplinary sanction in addition or alternative to a written warning or a dismissal. Quite a useful thing that can be. Have clauses covering the use and return of your property. The garden leave clause, great thing for more for senior members of a team, that somebody gives notice and you think, well, I don't want you in, but I don't want you just disappearing straight away. I don't want you having access to my data. Put a garden leave clause in so they have to sit at home. Or they have to be at home but doing different work. It depends how it's drafted. For goodness sake, protect your confidential information, your IP rights contractually. You know, I see it all the time. It's done incredibly badly. You've got, you know, and I know, you know, I've had a list from Eve as to what the businesses are. Some of you are handling pretty confidential information. You need to have obligations on your staff as to how they manage that information contractually and what they return when they leave. And then the final bullet point on this, have post-employment restrictions, restrictive covenants as needed. I had a case, it was about 2 years ago, where I had in 1 week 2 inquiries. One from an existing client who we'd done their contracts for, who had had their sales director leave, and another from a client we'd never dealt with before, who'd also had a sales director leave. One had, our client, had lovely restrictive covenants and a beautiful contract, all signed, and they had the ability then to get a grip on that sales director and manage what happened. He wasn't allowed to poach clients, he wasn't allowed to go and work for a competitor, all sorts of things he had to do. The other one had none of this in place, and they were pretty much at the mercy of that sales director. Of course, you know, shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. Get that done early, because you'll only find how exposed you are when it's too late. So, I'm not saying you do this willy-nilly, and I'm not saying touch wood. I've never had to go to court yet to enforce restrictive covenants. We've always managed to do a deal somehow, but you can't do a deal if you haven't got the place to stand and fight, if you haven't got the covenants in place. Think about it. So, I'm not even going to look at these clauses, because these are the ones that when I send the slides on to Eve and she forwards on the slides to you, you can nick and use in your own contract. So the ones I've given for you before, they're the whistles and bells, those bullet points, the previous. So these things I've been going on about, these are the whistles and bells. They're not the bare minimum you have to put in, because you can get that online, or you can come to some other training I do and I'll tell you exactly how to put your contracts together in more detail. What I'm giving you in these slides is the other bits and pieces for you to think about and cross-check with your own documents. I'm not even going to talk about these next 2 slides, because these are the freebies I'm giving you that I know are generic and that you can just go, oh, I'll have that, and plonk it in your own contract. Okay. If you want to talk about any of that, give me a shout. Staff handbooks. So you don't have to have a staff handbook. All you have to have is a disciplinary and grievance procedure and a staff privacy notice. That's basically, and I'll give you a data protection policy. The ones in bold are the ones I think pretty much every business should have. Home and hybrid working only if it applies to you. The ones not in bold are the ones that I think are optional extras. Depends on how you operate and what the score is with your business. Home and hybrid working, a lot of that going on at the moment. You should be amending your contracts and you should be developing home and hybrid working policies if you've got people working from home. You've got insurance issues, you've got health and safety issues, you've got data protection issues, you've got what happens if it doesn't work issues. All of it needs to be put in writing. And again, any thoughts like that or any queries, give us a shout. If you offer accommodation to your staff, you should have paperwork in place. If you have them using your vehicles, you should have paperwork in place. If you have any, what you call freelance staff, which always sets alarm bells ringing with me, you should have documentation in place. If you've got apprentices, make sure they're on proper contracts, not common law apprenticeship contracts, because if they're on common law apprenticeship contracts, you are taking a massive risk that if you get rid of them early because they're no good, that they can sue you for the remainder of their earnings that they would have earned for the rest of their apprenticeship. It happens all the time. It's relatively easy to draft the contracts so they're not common law apprentices, and all that risk just disappears. So anyone employing apprentices got any concerns about that, give me a shout. Don't have a redundancy policy because you want maximum flexibility when it comes to making redundancies. I put a line straight through them when I see them in clients' staff handbooks. Family and others similarly, don't kill many trees by regurgitating the statutory minimum, which is what most of you will offer when it comes to maternity leave, for instance. You can just have 2 lines. We will comply with our statutory obligations. And what I do is I put a link to the relevant bit of the YouGov website. It means that when the government, as it often does, changes the law, you don't have to update your handbook. And you're not just regurgitating, essentially, we will do the minimum. Clearly, if you have enhanced offerings with maternity, statutory paternity pay, etc., that needs to be in the contract. And numerous practical matters can be covered within your staff handbook. How to book a holiday, how to inform if you're off sick. And I could double that list, triple that list in terms of other policies that are available that we could offer you. Adverse weather. All it takes is a snap winter, and I always get half a dozen inquiries about adverse weather policies. Uniform, smoking. There's a whole massive range of things that can be talked about if you need them. What I'm saying is, does what you have fit what you need? And if not, what are you going to do about it? Because these bits of paper give you a massive advantage. It's fair to have it in place for staff. It limits the scope for dispute. It means if there are disputes, you stand a better chance of coming out on top. Really quickly, some just general tips. Just as I said, tricks of the trade, things that you learn. Some of them obvious, some of them less obvious. It's normally safer to dismiss somebody before they get to 2 years service, because at 2 years service, they get what we call ordinary unfair dismissal rights. There are rights that accrue before that, though. So if you dismiss somebody for a prohibited reason, because they've whistleblown, because they've raised health and safety concerns, because they've got maternity rights, because they've raised national minimum wage and working time regulation issues, that is a dismissal for that reason is classed as an automatically unfair dismissal, and the person doesn't have to have 2 years service. Also, there's no 2-year qualifying period. There's no qualifying period for discrimination. So 2 years, earlier than 2 years is much safer than after 2 years and much easier, but there are still some risks. And 2 years isn't 2 years. So if you dismiss, so if somebody started on the 6th of July 2020, their 2 years is up as on the 5th of July 2020, plus their statutory notice period is added in certain circumstances. So don't leave it to the last minute. Take probation seriously. When you have somebody start, induct them, keep an eye on them, set review dates at the outset as to conversations you're going to have with them as to how they're going to get on, how they're getting on, monitor progress, feedback any comments, good or bad, keep it under review. If they pass probation, give them a pat on the back, well done, you've passed probation. Keep it up. If they haven't, or there are problems, extend the probation. Don't just let them drift through it. In your disciplinary and performance review procedures, don't have verbal warnings as an official sanction. They are a disaster and they just make life harder for you. So verbal warning is, it's an official warning, but it's verbal. What is the point of that? One, they're handled badly. Two, all the law ever demands is first written warning, final written warning, dismissal. Why would you have a fourth level that makes it harder to dismiss somebody who's not performing? Ditch verbal warnings. That's not to say you don't informally talk to somebody and say, we've got a concern. It's meaning the level of sanction at the bottom, which is, we're going to go through a process and the punishment is a verbal warning that's going to go on your record. Get rid of that because it's more hassle than it's worth. Ensure your policies do not provide for notice of or the right to be accompanied at investigatory meetings. Unless there are exceptional circumstances, somebody has a disability, for instance, or English isn't their first language. Except in exceptional circumstances where it might be a reasonable adjustment, don't allow in your policies the person to have the right to be accompanied to investigatory meetings. Because you give it a massive advantage. Let's say there's been a scuffle or something's happened. You can say to the people involved, Barry, can I have a word? Call them straight in and say, what happened on Thursday? You're going to get something out of them. They're going to tell you stuff. If you do it the other way and you say, you give them notice of the meeting, they've got the right to be accompanied, they've got time to get their story straight. And that gives up a massive advantage when it comes to investigating matters. Because often you'll get story A when they're having to think on their feet. When they see the evidence prior to the disciplinary and their story A doesn't fit with the evidence, at the disciplinary hearing, you get story B. And remembering what we said at the beginning, you've just got to have reasonable grounds to believe somebody is guilty. One of the reasonable grounds you might have, you've changed your story. I think you might be lying. So don't have that. I see it again, it's a common failing, except in exceptional circumstances, don't have that. Ensure the right to be accompanied is only a trade union rep or colleague, except in exceptional circumstances, and not a person of your choosing. I was the person of someone's choosing who went to a disciplinary hearing once. They won't do that again. You don't want that. You want to stick to the rules. Remember, past poor performance does not justify future poor performance. So the argument, so somebody who's been not very good for 20 years doesn't mean to say you can't decide to tackle the fact that they're not very good. But the argument, I've always been crap and I'd quite like to continue being crap, is not acceptable. And I often get it, well, but he's always been like this. Well, then it's long overdue that you should intervene. Now, you might have to be a bit more gentle in how you get the person to the required standard. Remember, the aim is to get them to the required standard. But the fact that they have always done it this way, and they may even say, but I've always done it this way. Yep, but it's not up to standard. Don't let past poor performance put you off tackling issues. Huge amounts of time is wasted by staff on their PCs or on their phones. Reasonable use is fine. Have policies governing it, what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do. You can introduce IT monitoring. You need to follow procedures, but it can significantly improve productivity. There's been I was reading in the paper, a business that went from 5-day working to 4-day working, but carried on paying people for 5 days. So the people, they had to get the same amount of work done in 4 days and they got paid for 5 days. They noticed a massive dip in the amount of time people were spending online. People decided to be more efficient. I know it because I've done it with numerous clients over the years. You can get a massive upswing in productivity by introducing new rules in the right way. You've got to be careful about IT monitoring though. Home hybrid working, I've covered that. Have the right policies in place. There are pros and cons for every employer and employee, but it is pretty much a proven thing now that allowing flexibility for your staff can improve productivity and retention. You've got to manage the risk, you've got to have paperwork in place, and you've got to retain the right to end the arrangements or change them as needed. But that flexibility with the right people in the right settings can deliver improved productivity and retention. Appraisal processes. I love appraisals. They're about communication. You've got to have sufficient time and focus. You've got to tell people and listen. They should be about a touching base as to what's going on. So use them properly. Oh, hang on a second, I just popped up the slide. Yeah, done it, fine. Requiring people to phone in sick, no text or emails means they might think twice if actually they're well enough to go to work. So they'll actually have to put on their best sickly voice rather than just ping a text out. Have proper return to work meetings, and careful attendance monitoring can improve attendance because you start to notice trends. Oh, Bloggins keeps taking the day off before they're on holiday or the day off after a bank holiday. And you can start to notice the outliers. It's very effective to have a conversation with somebody on their return to work meeting and say, you know, you've had this number of days off over this period and you're 25% above the company average. That one conversation will often create a significant improvement in attendance. And if it doesn't, you've got a record of that discussion. You've got the scope potentially to move that to formal with some evidence that you've already tried to make it in to deal with it informally. Targeted bonuses, the carrot and the stick. I remember how bored our children when they were younger got of us shouting at them, for God's sake, will you get in the car, trying to get them out the door on time for school. Much to my disappointment, because I thought they were brighter than this, putting a piece of cardboard on the fridge with the ability to put some gold stars on it was transformational. I was so disappointed in them that they were so easily led. The carrot often works better than the stick. If you're trying to achieve something, productivity, customer satisfaction, attendance, gold stars work better than shouting at people. Have a targeted bonus that is specific, and it needn't even be money. It might be you get an extra day's holiday to be taken when you want, or we're going to pay for you to go on a spa day. Whatever you want to do, it is amazing. As I say, we're all children at heart, but you've got to define it. It mustn't be discriminatory. Ensure it's properly defined. Train people. You know, some of you are from some quite big businesses, so you will have managers who are managing a number of people. If you can get those managers to be right-headed about intervening and following processes and tackling stuff, that one person, if they manage 20 people, that's having an effect on 20 people. Think about specific training for those types of managers about performance, conduct, and building their skills and confidence about delivering as a manager. And again, if that's something you want to talk to me or Eve about, that is, you know, we can do that on a bespoke basis if need be. Mediation is wonderful and so much better, generally speaking, than formal processes. You've got to handle it carefully. It's often quicker, cheaper, more effective than formal processes. So if you've got a situation of bullying and teams have broken down and you've had to go through a process where half the team have slagged off the manager saying she's a bully, you've got to put that back together again somehow. Mediation is often the way to do it. If you had a team breakdown, you've got bickering in a team or two staff have fallen out, mediation is so much better at dealing with this than a grievance straight disciplinary process where there are just winners and losers. It's cheaper, quicker, better. And I will say to clients, well, I can advise you on going through a process. It's going to cost you double the amount. It has less chance of being successful, and you're going to have a winner and a loser. What we can do for half the cost is I'll come in and do a mediation for you. And it is remarkable. When it works, it's like magic, and clients just love it. UK is not good. UK lawyers don't like mediation because they'd rather have double the fees than solve the problem for half the cost. Mediation is wonderful. In any sort of dispute, it's better than litigation. You should litigate as a last resort. So I'm sorry I've gone on a bit, but I do tend to, I'm afraid. That's the additional training we've got coming up with the chamber that goes into more detail on some of these topics. Get in touch with me or Tracy or on the website if you want to book it. Questions, I'll take in a second. And equally, if you want to ring me or email me, feel free. I will forward these slides and the checklists I talked about onto Eve. She'll forward it on to you. And there will be a contact form that goes with that as well. So email it back to me and I can put you on our records to keep you informed going forwards. So do please complete it and return it to me. It also provides for you, if you want us to do an employment law audit, where we will review your paperwork and tell you red, green, amber. It's free. That form allows you to say, can we do that, please? So, and if you've got any brain picking, if you've got any questions you want to talk to me about afterwards, feel free. So, here we are. Eve's there. Sorry, I've overrun slightly. If there's anything you want to ask me about now, feel free. Alternatively, if you want to raise it afterwards, give me a bell or ping me an email. Or there's a chat